Hello everyone and welcome to the chapter number 78 of the Blender Master Course Face Rigging Part 2. In the previous chapter, we begin with the understanding of the basic concepts of face rigging for a 3D character. There we created the facial expressions for the character and we also created some bones for the face rigging. And in this particular chapter, we'll be moving a step ahead as we'll learn about using a custom shape in place of the bones, and we'll also be adding some bone constraints in order to restrict the transformation and the rotation of the bones. And for those of you who are new to this course, you can watch the previous 77 chapters from the link of the playlist given in the pinned comment. So we have created this 3D model of the character and we have also created the final rig for the character and some facial expressions also. And if you want to download the Blender file with the 3D model of this character with the rigging, then you can join the Patreon of this channel by clicking on the link given in the description of this video. Now to continue with the face rigging, we'll switch to the solid mode, and in the last chapter we created these 7 facial bones, and in this particular chapter we'll be learning about replacing these bones with a custom shape. So to create a custom shape, first press Shift plus A, go to curve and add circle. Let's zoom out, and here we have the Bezier circle added in our scene. Now to change its shape, tab into the edit mode, press A to select everything, and to give it a square or a rectangular shape, we'll first scale it down in the X axis and then we'll scale it up in the Y axis. If you want, you can try to change the scale values in the different axes in order to give the shape of this curve a different look. Now let's return back to the object mode and we'll now work on replacing these facial bones with this Bezier circle that we have just added. So to do this, first of all select the rig. Now press Ctrl plus Tab to enter the pose mode, and we need to select that particular bone that we want to replace with the Bezier circle. So first of all, I will select this particular bone which is for the left eyebrow. Then I'll open the bone properties, and in the viewport display, here we have the option to select a custom object. In this, I'll be selecting the Bezier circle, and after this, you will notice that the bone is now replaced with the Bezier circle. In fact, you can even change the location or the scaling of this shape in different axes by using these settings. Also, one more thing to consider here is that the X, Y and the Z axis in the custom shape settings is based on the local axis of the original Bezier curve. You can also understand it in this way that the rotation of the original Bezier curve and the one that replaces the bone is not the same. We can clearly see that the one which replaces the bone is rotated by an angle of 90 degrees. Now moving ahead, we'll go to the front view and we'll be changing the scaling of this custom shape. So go to the scaling in the Y axis and we'll reduce it to something like 0.7. And with this, we are having a perfect custom shape in place of the bone. Also, it completely depends upon you that which particular shape you want to add in place of the bones. We are doing this procedure of replacing the bones with the shapes so that we can easily use the controls of the face rigging. Moving ahead, we'll do the same procedure with the other bones also. So I'll select this one which is for the right eyebrow. Then in the bone properties, go to custom object and we'll select the Bezier curve. Let's change the scaling in the Y axis to 0.7, or maybe let's reduce it to something like 0.4 or 0.5. Let's do the same for this one also. So we'll reduce the scaling in the Y axis to 0.4 and now it looks perfect. Moving ahead, I will select this bone for the right eye, and in the custom object, I'll again select the Bezier circle. Let's scale it down in the X and Y axis to something like 0.7. Let's also move it slightly upwards. So in the translation of the Y axis, I'll enter a value of 0.01 meters. Now let's repeat the same step for this particular bone also. So I'll go to the custom object, select the Bezier curve, then in the scaling, I will enter 0.7 in both the X and the Y axis. Then for the translation, we'll be entering 0.01 in the Y axis. Similarly, let's also add the custom shapes for the mouth bone. So I'll select this particular bone, go to custom object and select the Bezier circle. Now first of all, I'll reduce the scale value in the Y axis to something like 0.7. Let's also move it slightly upwards. So I'll go to the translation in the Y axis and keep it to something like 0.05, and now it looks perfect. Moving ahead, I'll select this particular bone which is for the open mouth. Then I'll go to the custom object and select the Bezier circle. Let's reduce the scaling in the Y axis to somewhere around 0.6 or 0.7, and let's also move it up by going to the translation in the Y axis and increasing it to something like 0.05, and now we'll select the last bone on the face which is to control the opening of the teeth. Now go to the custom object, select the Bezier circle. Let's reduce the scaling in the Y axis to 0.6 or 0.7, and we'll also move it up by going to the translation in the Y axis and changing it to somewhere around 0.05 meters. And with this, we have successfully created the custom shapes in place of the facial bones. Now moving ahead, if I select any particular control for the face, for example this left eye, and press G to move it, then you will notice that we are able to freely move it in any direction and by any value. Similarly, we can also scale it up by pressing S or scale it down to any extent. However, for a proper face rigging, it is mandatory to set a restriction on the values within which all these facial controls will transform, rotate and scale. And for this particular purpose, we'll be using the bone constraints. So for this, I'll first select this control which is for the the mouth of the character, and to add a bone constraint to restrict its movement, first we'll open the bone constraints properties by clicking on this icon, then go to the add menu, and since we want to control or basically restrict the movement of the control or the bone, so we'll be adding the limit location constraint. So we'll select it from here, and yes, if you want to understand about all the important constraints in complete detail, then you can watch these 3 chapters where we understood about the constraints in Blender. Now coming back to our scene, if I go to the limit location constraint and turn on all these options in the minimum and the maximum values, then you will notice that the control will suddenly disappear from the scene. And this is because currently Blender has selected the world space by default, meaning that it will only consider the world axis and not the local axis of the control, meaning that the location of that control is now restricted to these values, which is 0 in all the 3 axes for the minimum range, and similarly 0 meters for all the 3 axes in the maximum also. In simple words, the object's location is now constrained to only one specific location, which is 0 meters in all the 3 axes, or basically the world origin, where we also have the 3D cursor. Like over here, you can see that at the center of the world, we are having this control for the mouth placed over here because of adding the limit location constraint. In fact, if I try to move it by pressing G, then you will notice that nothing will happen. But suppose I want that instead of considering the world origin, it should rather consider the local axis of the control. So to do this, go to the owner option in the limit location constraint and change this from the world space to the local space. And now you will notice that the mouth control is again placed at its default location. And since we have selected the local space, then now it will consider the local axis of the control and not the global axis. And to see those axes in the 3D viewport, first of all, in the transform orientations, select local, and in this tool menu, we'll turn on the move control. And now over here, you can see that the local x-axis for this control is in this direction, which is also aligning with the global x-axis. However, the local y-axis of the control is in the upward direction, which for the global axis means the positive z-axis. But as I told you earlier, we have selected the local space in the limit location constraint, and as a result, we'll only be considering the local axis of the control. So right now, if I try to move this control, then you will notice that the location of the control is not changing. However, if I go to the maximum x value and increase it to 0.1 meters, and then if I try to move it by pressing G, then you will notice that we are able to move it, but only up to a small distance, and that too only in the x-axis. Now if you want that we should also be able to move it up and down, then for this we'll go to the maximum y value and change it to a very small number like 0.1 meters only. And now if I try to move it in the upward direction, then you will notice that it is now moving both in the x-axis and also in the y-axis. Similarly, if you want to move the control in the negative axis also, then for this we'll go to the minimum x and y values and change them to minus 0.1 meters. And now if I try to move the control by pressing G, then you will notice that the control is now moving in the positive axis and also the negative axis. Also, it's not mandatory that you have to assign exactly these values in the limit location constraint. If you want, you can change the values depending upon the size of the controls. So for now, I'll be entering the value in the x-axis to minus 0.15 for the minimum and positive 0.15 in the maximum. Now moving ahead, let's reset the position of this control. So for this, go to the pose menu, then in the clear transform, select all. Now the next control that I'll select is this one, which we have added to control the opening and the closing of the mouth. As a result, we need to apply the limit location constraint to restrict the movement of this constraint only in the downward direction. So for this, in the bone constraint properties, click on add bone constraint and select the limit location. Now in the owner, select the local space, and we'll also turn on all these options for the minimum and the maximum values in all the 3 axes. Also, it's advisable to turn on the effect transform in the limit location constraint for all the controls. So in the last one also, we'll turn on the effect transform. And now coming back to this control, which we have to move only in the downward direction, we simply need to set the minimum value in the local y-axis to something around negative 0.1 meters. And now if I try to move this control by pressing G, then you will notice that it is only moving in the downward direction. And yes, the reason why we are seeing a lag in the performance is that I have not hidden the characters here in the scene. So I'll go to the object mode first, then I'll select the character's body, and in the particle properties, I'll turn off the real-time display of the particle system. Now select the rig again, press Ctrl plus Tab to enter the pose mode, and now if I try to move the control, then now there will be no lag. Moving ahead, the next control on which we'll apply the bone constraint will be this one, which is for controlling the movement of the teeth of character. And just like the control for the movement of the mouth, we need to restrict the movement of this control also only in the downward direction or the negative y-axis. So for this, this, with this control selected, I'll hold the shift button and select the control which is for the mouth opening and closing. Then to apply the same bone constraint, go to the bone constraint properties and in the limit location constraint, click on this icon and click on copy to selected. Now if I deselect everything and select only the control for the teeth, then this limit location constraint is now added to this control, meaning that if I press G to move it, then its location will get restricted only to the negative y-axis for the downward movement. Now moving ahead, if I select any of the controls and press S to scale it down or R to rotate it, then you will notice that we can easily change the rotation or the scaling of any of the controls. And to avoid any mistakes due to accidental rotating or scaling, we'll be locking the rotation and scale of all these controls. So to do this, first press N to open the side toolbar, and in the item category, we have the option to control the rotation and the scaling. And to restrict the rotation and the scaling, we simply need to click on these lock buttons along these values. And now if I try to rotate or scale the control, you will notice that we are not able to do it. Let's do the same with the other controls also. So I'll select this one and I'll click on the locks in the rotation and the scaling values. Similarly for this one also, click on the lock buttons for the rotation and the scaling values. And now moving ahead, we'll be working on the controls for the eyes and the eyebrows of the character. So first of all, I have selected the left eye of the character, and in this particular case, we need to limit the rotation of the eye. To understand this concept in more detail, I'll go to the object mode, then with the body of the character selected, press tab to enter the edit mode. Let's also open the material preview mode, and now with everything deselected, if I keep my cursor over the left eye of the character and press L to select it and try to rotate it in the x-axis, then you will notice that the eyes are rotating properly in the x-axis. Similarly, if I try to rotate it in the z-axis, then the rotation looks like this. And also while rotating, you can see on the top left corner that it shows the specific value of rotation. So for the rotation of the eyes, we'll be limiting it to a value of 45 degrees in all the three axes. So let's return back to the object mode, then go to the solid mode also, and with the rig selected, press Ctrl plus tab to enter the pose mode. Now with this control selected for the left eye, go to the bone constraint properties, click on add bone constraint, and in this case, we'll be selecting the limit rotation constraint. Now in the owner, select the local space and we'll turn on the limit X, limit Y and the limit Z. Let's also turn on the effect transform, and to set the values, I'll first go to the limit X and enter minus 45 degrees for the minimum value. Then in the maximum, I'll enter positive 45 degrees, and we repeat the same step for the remaining axis. So let's enter 45 here. Then in the Z axis, minimum will be minus 45 and maximum will be positive 45 degrees. Now to apply the same bone constraint to the right eye also, then for this, first I'll select the right eye, then with the shift key hold it, select the left eye on which we already used the limit rotation constraint. Now click on this icon and click on copy to selected, and with this we have now applied the limit rotation constraint to both the eye controls. Moving ahead, we'll now select the left eyebrow, and for this one we'll be using both the limit location and the limit rotation constraint. So with this control selected, go to the bone constraint properties, click on add bone constraint, and first I'll be selecting the limit location. Then in the owner, select the local space and we'll turn on all these options. Now in the minimum X and the Y, I will enter a value of somewhere around minus 0.05 meters, and in the maximum for the X and Y axis, we'll be entering a value of somewhere near positive 0.05 meters. And now if I go to the 3D viewport and press G to move it, then you can see here that the movement of the eyebrow is now constrained. Similarly, let's also apply the constraint for the rotation of this eyebrow control, because if I try to rotate it in the X axis, then it will rotate like this. However, in this particular case, we want the rotation to only exist in the local Z axis. So for this, click on add bone constraint and we'll be selecting the limit rotation. Then we'll first enable the limit for all the three axes, and in the owner, select the local space. Also turn on the effect transform, and now to set the values, I'll go to the limitation in the Z axis and change the minimum to minus 30 degrees and the maximum to positive 30 degrees. And now if I press R to rotate the constraint, then you will notice that the rotation of the control is now restricted. Similarly, to apply the same constraint for this control also, for the right eyebrow, I'll first select this, then with the shift key hold it, select the control for the left eyebrow, and first of all, in the limit location, click on copy to select it, and then in the limit rotation, again click on the copy to select it, and with this the same constraint is now applied to the right eyebrow also. And so with this we now arrive to the end of this chapter. Today we learnt about the creation of some custom shapes for the rigging bones, and we also added the bone constraints to limit their location and the rotation. And in the next chapter we'll be finishing with the face rigging, since we'll be creating the drivers for the face controls. So our next chapter will be the chapter number 79, face rigging part 3. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel, press that notification bell so that you can get timely updates about the upcoming chapters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.